Welcome to the Lightbulb Moment podcast. You are listening to episode 10, Designing for the Virtual Classroom, part 1. I'm your host, Mike, and I'm joined by virtual classroom expert Joe. In this episode, is designing for virtual different from face-to-face? We focus on the 3 to 5 minute rule, and Joe messes up Mike's podcast plans. So, Joe, today we're talking about designing for the virtual classroom. Now, how did you find this when you first started? Was it quite a big culture shock, changing from face-to-face design to then designing for a virtual environment?
Yeah, because initially I was focused entirely on the technology part of it. And what's a poll? Where does this go? What's a chat room? What do I do? How does it even work? Where do I put my notes? So that was quite a culture shock. And then when I got beyond that and more comfortable, then it was how do I make the most of the technology and overcome that I can't see people.
And, you know, we've had people who've come to us and said, right, we've ran our first couple of virtual classrooms. We basically used a face-to-face session plan. And majority of those people then say, you know, there were fatal flaws or major problems when they did that. So take us through what are the main differences between face-to-face? What's the same? What do you need to do for designing for the virtual classroom?
So we've gone through a lot of our podcast about some of the skills that you absolutely do need, which are going to be the same in a virtual classroom, and you can go back and listen to those. What we're looking at in terms of differences is that your delivery mode or modality is different. You can't physically see people. Even if you have a webcam on, it's not the same as being in the same room as people, even though that can be good. Also, you've got the technology, the platform, Adobe Connect, WebEx, Zoom, whatever that might be. In theory, that should be an enabler to bring people together from different areas, but that can also be a barrier. If it's not logging on or hearing, it's how do I use the different bits? So they're the first things to think about.
So tell me about how the design of the actual session is going to be different from a face-to-face session.
So you always start with the same basic principles of what's the business need, what are the activities that people actually need to perform at work and therefore practice in the session, what are the things that we need to discuss or do, and what extraneous knowledge and experience do people have, what's out there on the internet, the social platform, the various kind of performance support tools to provide the knowledge part of that. Once you've got all of those basics in place, which should be for any training, then you need to be looking at what are the activities to do online and following some principles such as we've spoken before about designing in an interaction every 3 to 5 minutes. So an interaction could be as simple as green tick or check mark if this, or could be a breakout room of half an hour, go and do a big activity. So it's designing those in every few minutes, which is very different from face-to-face. Often you wouldn't do it quite as detailed as that.
So are we saying, because like you've mentioned in the previous podcast, we've covered the different skills that are either the same or need to be adapted for the virtual classroom. So does this then equate pretty much exactly the same for the design? It's updating those different skills you need to do and actually inserting them into the design of the session to make sure you get that interaction, that green tick, that equivalent of a nod. Is this what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked with some people over the last couple of years, and one person in particular, she's an amazing face-to-face facilitator, and she works with me for her online stuff. And she always focuses first on what technology should we use? Are we using enough technology? And I always say to her, that's not our first worry. Our first worry is what do they need to do and what activities are we going to get them to do in order to know and practice and experience those things.
I guess this comes back to what we said before about breaking it all down, isn't it? Break it down to what is the main learning point, what is your skill set, what do you need to deliver, and then designing a session around that.
Absolutely. And that's all really good instructional design, no matter what your modality. What we then need to look at with the virtual classroom, and I say to this person, don't worry about the technology part. Plan in your head or on paper or with me, what would you normally do face to face? Would it normally be people in groups at tables discussing? Great, that's a breakout. Would it normally be on a flip chart? Great, we'll use a whiteboard. So it's not letting the technology get in the way, but like you say, it's taken all those things we've discussed so far, breaking them down and rebuilding them online. So if I would normally tell a story, scan the room, pick on someone to tell me more, there I have to tell the story, use maybe a yes, no, or a poll or a green tick check mark activity, maybe ask somebody for a hand up in the feedback emoticons, and then get them to tell their story. So it's just about designing that in so that I know to say green tick if, or hand up if, or in the chat window please, and to keep that momentum going, that every 3 to 5 minutes, as long as it's appropriate, to keep people engaged.
And where do you start when it comes to this? So say I come along and say I've got this face-to-face session, or at least 2 or 3 face-to-face sessions as part of my course. I need to convert it to virtual classrooms. What would you say to me, or what would you do to start off that process?
We'd go through that bit that we've all talked about before, business needs and all of that kind of stuff. Make sure that actually the training as it is now is a really solid, proper piece of training. And whilst it's another topic, it's something that we come across again and again. And with the greatest of respect to the people that we work with, the training that has been designed isn't always the best version of what it could be for the job. So it's doing that bit first.
To be fair, it's probably a legacy of some other kind of course which has been adapted and serviced and things like this.
Or it could be an external vendor. It can be a lack of time and resource. So many reasons for it. So it really is with the greatest of respect that I say that.
But perhaps then when it comes to virtual classrooms, because so much of it needs to be broken down to what you need to get in a short amount of time, or potentially short amount of time, it then gives a chance to refocus what those learning points are that you then need to get across in the virtual classroom.
Absolutely. I was working with a team a little while ago, and we were converting their face-to-face session to a virtual classroom course. And what we were going through was their slides and their notes, all very good, activities were all fine, but it was quite delivery heavy and not very interaction and engagement heavy. So my job was to go through this almost with the teacher's red pen, if you like, going, where's the interaction? Where's the engagement? Where's the activity? Are you talking for more than 5 minutes at a time? And whilst it wasn't quite like that, I didn't send them back a red scrawl of horribleness. It was, if we have that approach in our head, that's the kind of thing I was going through to try and make sure that what was delivered online was the most engaging, interactive version of that.
Okay, so are we saying effectively, if you have a face-to-face session, it would need some kind of adapting to work virtually, the majority of cases?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes of people that have then just taken a face-to-face session? I mean, off the top of your head, 3 or 4 items of, well, that just doesn't equate to a virtual classroom. Can you think of any?
So first of all, it's the lack of interaction very often. So that 3 to 5 minute rule, because often in a classroom, we can get away with 5, 10, 15 minutes of delivery because we can see people and we can feed back on what they're doing, but we can't do that in the virtual classroom. Other things are where facilitators ask certain questions in certain ways, which could just be, what do you think of that? But actually, those questions aren't very well worded for the virtual classroom. It needs to be much more specific, because you want them to answer in a certain way. Is it chat? Is it microphone? But also, you might need to build up your question in a slightly different way and be more specific. Apart from knowing your technology, it's the facilitator knowing how to do this online and not just talking.
Okay, so potentially it's what we've covered over and over. It's planning those engagement points to actually make sure that that's going to work. Mm-hmm. So in which case, you've mentioned 3 to 5 minutes or even less amount of time than that to actually have engagement within a virtual classroom. Now, this is obviously what you try and strive for, what we try and strive for, but not all of our clients, and a lot of them have admitted right at the start, we're not going to do that. We're going to do, at least it's going to be 5 minutes, maybe longer. I mean, why do you recommend 3 to 5 minutes? Why do you want to design around 3 to 5 minutes? And can it be done differently?
Things can always be done differently. And I've said before, you can have a really great, informative, entertaining lecturer, and they can be engaging in their manner of delivery. And we've all seen, science lectures on the BBC at Christmas. We've all been to university where there was that one lecturer who was just always engaging, and you would just sat there and enjoyed listening and learned from it. But more often than not, you get somebody who drones on about something. And the trouble is that you bore people. It's one thing in a lecture hall or a conference area where you've got people's attention a little bit differently. But when you're on a computer and somebody's got their email pinging away, their colleagues or their boss walking behind them and speaking to them, their phone next to them with Twitter, Facebook, text messages on, suddenly people are going to disengage. And that is the big issue. And also, the other big issue with this is I can't look around the room and see what people are doing. I can't see that body language that says, yeah, they're with me, or no, they're not, or they don't get it, or they do get it, or they've got questions. That's why I have to have that interaction built in to give that opportunity. And it feeds back to me so that I can go, yep, they're getting it, let's carry on. Or no, they're not. Let me explain this a bit more.
I bet there's a lot of lecturers out there which they have the people come there and they've got their laptop open and they're wondering, are they writing down what I'm saying, or are they surfing the internet? But I guess this is the equivalent of, you've got somebody in a lecture hall, but they've got a tablet, their phone, they've got their computer, they're surrounded by their friends, and also potentially having emails and things like this. And that lecturer will, I guess has to have some kind of faith. And I think you've said that, in previous podcasts, you've got adult learners. You have to have some faith that they're actually doing this. But the engagement of 3 to 5 minutes is where you can bring in just to get an update on where they're at.
Yes, exactly.
And so then going forward, the other side of doing this, so if we did have people, and we've had some of our clients have said this, that they're looking at more like every 20 minutes because they've got so much content they need to deliver. This can still work. Is there a different style that you need to make sure how this happens? Like, do you need a quiz every 20 minutes? How's this going to work?
Yeah, it definitely can do. It's going to be a different type of session. So I always say to people, it's partly about how many people are in that session and what you're doing. So if you are at the more delivery end, here's 10, 15, 20 minutes of delivery, then that is going to be a different type of session. And you aren't going to get the engagement, the deep learning, the learning transfer that you will do by making it an interactive hands-on session. But that can still be fine. It can still be a really good session where you've got that delivery, because then it's about how good is your delivery and how good is your presenter or facilitator. You can still have engagement. It could be, for instance, that you have somebody moderating or producing in the chat. So whilst the presenter or facilitator isn't stopping and breaking into those interactions and activities, there can still be that conversation going on in the chat window. It could even just be the interaction is more like a few polls and lots of green ticks and hands up. It doesn't have to be the discussion and the activity base that is what we promote generally in the virtual classroom.
Yeah, and I think this is probably where a lot of people come from, where they think this engagement every 3 to 5 minutes is going to be a poll, is going to be getting everyone on microphones in it, and it doesn't have to be that way, does it?
No, it can be really small.
And so then in which case, you mentioned activities and, you would want to try and plan more activities in, whereas potentially in this session where it's every 20 minutes you have engagement, you'd have less activities. So what kind of activities do you plan around in your session design?
Oh, that's a really big question. Because
I like to leave you with just a massive open-ended question there. But, 1 or 2, what were some of the first activities when you were first starting with virtual classrooms that you actually sat there and went, I'm going to try this, or I think this will work. This is going to get engagement. I'm going with this.
Yeah. So I can tell you, first of all, one of my biggest mistakes right at the very, very beginning of my career.
Oh, I thought you were going to say 18 months ago when you hired me. But
and this was, I was delivering a mock session to get some feedback. And by Jove, I needed this feedback. And I delivered, I sort of run a poll. And, the mock attendees had put in their answers and I'd gone, oh, and we've got X% this and X% that and what have you, and moved on and just carried on talking. And what I hadn't done, which I always preach now because of this very mistake, is I hadn't said, hand up if that was you, why did you choose that? Or in the chat window, what's your thoughts about the answers that you see here? And have the discussion around that piece of content.
Interesting. So you'd actually planned your engagement, but then hadn't actually utilised it or involved people about it.
Yeah.
So they engaged by clicking, but they weren't really engaged at all.
Yeah, and it's a real subtle difference because on paper you go, yep, I've run a poll. That's brilliant. Engagement every 3 minutes. Tick. Yay, go me. But in reality, the feedback I got was, you spoke for 12 minutes without stopping. You didn't interact with us about this. You didn't change what you were delivering based on what it is that we had clicked on in this poll. And that has stayed with me all these years.
So I guess this goes back to the identifying those learning needs and outcomes at the start. And then when you actually plan these engagement activities, whether it's a whiteboard or a poll, there needs to be a reason for it. There's no point of just going, I've listened to Joe's podcast. She says engagement every 3 to 5 minutes. So like you say, tick, I've done a poll, tick, I've done agreed check, tick, I've done this, whatever it is. There needs to be a reason and an actual learning outcome for doing it.
Yeah. And it's really easy to stick with the same thing, polls and green ticks, or it can be really easy, and I've done this too, to go massively over the top, which I know nobody who knows me would ever think
I don't believe that.
But to go really go to town and create something, and then it ends up as this convoluted, complicated, technically difficult mess. And then you go, you know what? A poll would have done that. With a bit of chat window, that would have been fine.
You know what? I thought of a question, and we didn't have this in the design or plan of what we've done for this podcast. So let's completely riff this for a second. But it's often what you do when you actually design a session. Maybe this is a bit more of an advanced item that we go over more in another podcast. But you sort of give yourself avenues of, if I'm getting this kind of response, I can go shorter on this slide, or I can go longer on this slide. And, you actually design it with, if I get these kind of responses from these polls, I can start going down this avenue because I can see how advanced they are. Now, maybe this, as I say, maybe this is an advanced podcast for another time, but should you try and design, maybe not if it's your first time you're designing a session, but should you try and keep it open so that you can play around with timings or different areas to focus on?
That's a really good point. And I would say you're right. That's more kind of intermediate advanced when you've got comfortable with the technology and got over those initial kind of fears and stuff. But it is a good point about being flexible in a virtual classroom or a webinar. And lots of the time I hear from people that you can't. And I understand why they think that, especially when, for instance, my facilitator guide that you can download from our blog, it's got down there, timings down to the 30-second mark, which I would never do in a million years in a face-to-face classroom. So I can understand why that is. But actually, you're right. If you design it in a certain way, you know your topic, and you've got comfortable with the technology in the delivery mode, then absolutely you can be flexible. And you know that as well as anyone from producing my sessions where you're getting all sweaty, thinking we're running out of time, and all of a sudden I turn it around, wrap it up, and because we've had so much conversation in a different place, things don't need to be as they were planned at the end of the session.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things where I've focused on the timings, whereas you're actually absorbing the content and the feedback of what you're getting from people and then judging how that is going to affect the rest of the session, which is just testament to your expertise.
Oh, I thank you. But no, it's about then knowing your content and thinking, well, I do have 2 or 3 slides on that later, and I'm not one to be slave to a slide, but let's put it this way for now. And then going, but I can just summarize that later. When I get to those points, I can either skip them or just summarize them and say, earlier on, we talked about ABC, green tick if you remember, or hands up if you've got any further questions on that. And actually, you've saved that 2 minutes per slide or whatever you'd planned, and that's caught you back up to time.
And maybe this highlights the fact that just through this discussion is the fact that through having these engagement points, that, you know, you get people on microphones, you get people answering polls, even just typing different ideas on a whiteboard, having a brainstorm. That's given you information as a facilitator of where your attendees are at and where you can take the direction of your session. And by not having that engagement, you're missing out on that potential path or the correct path, let's say, to actually take your session in.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, I've delivered some courses, like there was one course I delivered in a previous role. It was all about the expenses system. And I'm not kidding you. I delivered that session 300 times, 350 times, which is madness, absolute madness. But I did. And this was face-to-face rather than virtual. But every single session was different, because you had to relate it to what the people were there to do, and you had to relate it to their questions, where they were. And some people, I remember the head of a department once, and he just spent his whole time going, yep, which said to me, shut up, Joe, I understand, move on. Whereas other people are just like,
so this is the equivalent of the go faster emoticon in some platforms, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if he could have had me on video, I would have been at 2 times speed at that point.
But I guess this then comes down to, and this is the difference between, I guess, a lot of, you know, we're saying like a lecture, a seminar at maybe a university or something is an equivalent to think about, is the fact that this is information that these people need. It's part of their textbook or workbook. They have to study it to fulfill whatever exam or whatever it is they're going to do. Whereas most of, especially for what we do, is for corporate virtual classrooms, and there is a learning outcome, there is a learning need, and it's not the same as, okay, I'm just going to lecture at you for 2 hours because you're then going to go study in the evening about this. It's actually having that discussion and engagement so that they can actually apply it once they leave that virtual classroom session.
Absolutely. Is that your summary?
I think that might be the summary. But
that stopped me in my tracks from telling you another 3 stories. So that's probably a good thing.
Exactly. But what I was going to say is the fact that I feel like this is a podcast we're going to have to come back to for design, because I actually had in my mind this was going to be more of the first steps of breaking it down, writing your first session and things like that. And I feel like this has more been an overview of the of design.
We should do that as our next podcast then, just those very first steps of how do you design your first ever virtual classroom.
Okay, well, it looks like our next podcast.
Have I completely screwed with the plan now, Mike?
Yeah, I've just like Control-Alt-Delete. I'm just closing the computer down. Okay, fine. So what we will do for our next session, we will do design again, but we will go through the basics of, you know, that initial, you know, because we didn't even cover slides, best practice with slides.
Or different platforms, different timings, structure.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to do in the next podcast. We've now officially decided. So stay tuned for that. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Fun as always, Mike.
Indeed. Until next time, bye.
Thank you for listening. We really hope you enjoyed it and look forward to your feedback and your comments. If you like the podcast, please remember to subscribe and to share. You can follow Mike on Twitter @MikeLightBulb. You can follow me on Twitter @LightBulbJoe, and for other updates @MomentLightBulb. You can also find our podcasts on YouTube, along with more great content. If you're in need of virtual classroom training, check out lightbulbmoment.online. For our blogs, lightbulbmoment.info. And remember our free community for questions and resources, lightbulbmoment.community.